Well, former ANC President Thabo Mbeki says that the ANC's 2021 local government results represent a reversal for the movement and an advance for right-wing forces. Now, in a letter addressed to the ANC's Deputy Secretary General Jessie Duarte, Mbeki says that he hopes that the ANC should carry much of the blame for the 2021 local government election outcome. Mbeki further proposes 4 urgent solutions, which are a renewal of the ANC, a true pursuit of the developmental state, and also urged the party to keep the election promises, among others. Mason Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, Mandla Isaacs, joins us now virtually to discuss all of this. Mandla, good morning, good evening to you on your side. Thanks so much for speaking to us.
Good morning to you and the viewers. Thanks for having me.
So, Mandla, firstly, what did you make of the letter? Did you find it to be, a useful introspection by the former ANC president for the party as a whole, reflecting on the outcome of this past election?
I found it to be quite curious. It's unfortunate that, for a leader of the stature of President Mbeki essentially has to advise his party in the form of such an elaborate, public letter. I mean, presumably it was private when he sent it, but it was always going to be made public. But to have to advise his party to do what any modern political party should be doing, which is to provide, leadership to the society that it purports to lead. He's essentially written an 8-page letter to the ANC to say, do your job, lead the country, provide leadership on its most urgent challenges. And it's especially damning after 27 years in power that the ANC is still talking about creating a capable and developmental state. How can it take 3 decades to create a capable state in a country with, skills and human talent, one of the leading countries on the African continent? It really boggles the mind.
And speaking of a developmental state, so this is something that we would hear all the time in terms of policies, policy outlooks, etc. So just in terms of addressing that issue, taking this developmental state forward, does this suggest that it's not happening, or does it suggest that perhaps the ruling party does not know how to actually give effect to it?
Well, I mean, I've been saying increasingly over the last several years that, when the ANC talks about this need to turn things around, if they knew how to do this, they would have done it already. So, a developmental state speaks to a high capability state, which is both embedded in, the dynamic forces of the economy, but is sufficiently disciplined that it can maintain autonomy and avoid capture, which obviously is ironic coming out of a decade of what we now describe as state capture. So, this idea of a developmental state, which the ANC has been talking about, throughout the democratic period, but especially so kind of since the mid-2000s under the leadership of President Mbeki and then Minister of Finance Trevor Manuel, is this idea of creating this kind of high capacity state, which is capable of working closely with economic leaders to drive developmental progress. But the fact that ANC leader after ANC leader continues to say, we need to create a developmental state, makes clear that they've been unsuccessful in doing it as to date. It actually makes you wonder, at some point, almost when you listen to when you read the Mbeki letter, the criticisms are almost worse than any of the ANC's external critics when you look at what it's actually saying about the quality of ANC governance.
Also, the former president speaks about the 2021 local government results, saying that it represents a reversal for the progressive movement, and it almost, makes a fertile ground for the advancement of right-wing forces. So what's your understanding of that, and who might these right-wing forces be?
To be honest, I don't believe that this flows out of some kind of, sober, objective analysis of the stakeholders in South African society. I don't believe that there's a shadowy right-wing cabal that is, trying to thwart the ANC and government. This, frankly, is a holdover of this kind of, socialist history of the ANC that, tries to divide society into these kind of class forces, the ANC representing the motive forces of the democratic revolution, which is in response to the sort of right-wing forces of racial, white supremacy and capitalism, to mix the sort of nationalist and socialist analyses. I think this is just a holdover of how people of Mbeki's generation see the world. And I think, frankly, it's outdated. I mean, it's like these phrases of white monopoly capital. Who is white monopoly capital when the PIC, as the kind of asset manager for essentially a black government, has a stake in many of these kind of institutions that we see of as representing WMC. Who are these right-wing forces or forces of white monopoly capital when many of the ANC's own leaders have stakes in some of the, commanding heights of the economy, to use language from another ANC document? I think it's holdover language from the past that, frankly, is not credible. The only people responsible for the ANC's loss is the ANC itself. It's been humbled because South Africans are saying, we demand governance. We're not interested in excuses. You are at fault. We don't believe that you've led our country in the way that you're supposed to, and therefore we're either going to withhold our votes or take them elsewhere.
So we saw last week the ANC's head of elections, Fikile Mbalula, blaming the SABC, saying that the SABC's coverage of the local government elections was to blame for, one, the low voter turnout, and also, two, for the ANC's poor performance in several municipalities and metros. How democratic can that be? I mean, blaming the SABC for the ANC's showing?
Frankly, this is just the absolute worst of the worst. I'm going to be absolutely frank with you. This is the last resort of a failed politician to blame the media. South Africans are not stupid. They're not being manipulated by the media. They can see with their own eyes. South Africans can see the state of their cities. They can see the state of their public transportation. For instance, a company like PRASA, which reports actually to, or takes its cues from the Department of Transport, which Mr. Mbalula leads, they can tell that their transport is unreliable, that their basic services are not reliable. They didn't have to be misled by, a capricious SABC. The public broadcaster is doing its job in reflecting the state of society and informing South Africans and showing them what's going on in their cities. And he should be blaming his own comrades more so than blaming the media for shining a light onto the ANC's failures in governance. It was absolutely poor from Minister Mbalula, and it just demonstrates the denialism. I'm absolutely and adamantly of the view that parties do not renew themselves in power, and that kind of showing from Mr. Mbalula is just an example of why they don't. The arrogance of incumbency, being completely out of touch. This is why parties need to be put out of power in order to renew themselves, to truly understand, where they've gone wrong, and to try to develop a new vision for society instead of, frankly, treating leadership as an entitlement.
And I can just imagine this conversation will be perhaps one that's put under the spotlight again, saying that here you have Mandla Isaacs, you bring this guy, and he essentially goes on another tirade saying that, this is what the ANC has failed as, forgetting completely the context of it, which is a letter that was written by a former president and leader of this particular movement to a party that has lost power at the polls, as it were.
And, this is why I say that if you read President Mbeki's letter and what he talks about the dynamics in terms of the leaders, the failed leaders, the troubling developments in terms of incompetence, being self-serving, putting their own needs ahead of the people, really the critiques that President Mbeki are making, which have been made, frankly, by ANC leaders since the mid-2000s, if you look at some of the organizational reports that he used to make, that former Secretary General Kgalema Motlanthe used to make, former Secretary General Gwede Mantashe used to make, they are frankly as devastating as any of the ANC's external critics. And so, this type of denialism and wanting to blame shifting by Minister Mbalula, unfortunately, is really not going to take the party anywhere. And if that is the type of discussions that ANC leaders are having, and that's the kind of views that they hold, frankly, they're going to continue to go downhill, because South Africans do not need the SABC to tell them that the electricity where they live is unreliable, the water where they live is unreliable, the sanitation is not reliable, the streets aren't clean. The SABC, frankly, is I don't want to say belatedly, because they've done good work over the years, but is really only shining a light on the decline that we've started to experience in some of our cities and towns. And so if he believes that it's the media being unfair on the ANC, and that's why they got into trouble in the most recent election, then clearly the ANC has only more and more wake-up calls ahead of them, unfortunately.
Mandla, at the crux of Mbeki's letter, he seems to raise a concern that if the ANC loses power, this could spell the reversal of the democratic gains that we've seen thus far. Is this an accurate view? Would democracy die in South Africa if the ANC lost power, or is it in specific reference to what happened in the Gauteng metros, would you say, looking at that letter?
Absolutely not. As I said earlier, the Mbeki, some of these views and the framing is really a holdover to the past, where it's really a window inside of the thinking of many within the ANC who fundamentally believe that, the ANC is the only institution that can lead democratic progress in South Africa, and that, any loss of support or loss of legitimacy of the ANC is simultaneously a threat to South Africa's democratic project. This is absolutely not so. South Africa is bigger than the ANC. South Africa will be fine, arguably. The fortunes of the ANC and the fortunes of South Africa are not the same thing, without question. So, I would completely reject that point of view. It would be great if the ANC at its best could lead the kind of progress South Africans deserve, could achieve, could lead progress on our biggest developmental challenges: unemployment, poverty, inequality, standard of living for South Africans, safety and security, life expectancy. But in the absence, if the ANC is unable to lead that, then frankly, then other organizations and individuals in South Africa with capacity can provide that leadership. The ANC is not the only game in town. South Africa is not solely dependent on the fortunes of the ANC for us to achieve progress as a society.
President Mbeki also makes urgent suggestions to the ANC, which are, among others, a renewal of the party. But then the ANC has been talking about its renewal for a long, long time, Mandla, as you know. So what are the chances that this letter will make any sort of difference in the way the party has been carrying on, especially when it comes to dealing with its internal challenges, given that, depending on who you speak to, they will tell you that the party is now more divided than it has ever been before?
There's absolutely, in my view, no chance of the ANC renewing itself while in power. You would have to ask yourself, why has the ANC not been able to do this all of this time? As I say, if these leaders, if the leaders in cabinet, most of whom have been here for the past decade or two, if they had this capacity to lead our country effectively, why would they have run it into the ground? Of course, they essentially blame it all on one man, former President Zuma. What I would say to you is, look at a country like the UK, look at a country like the US. Parties renew themselves out of power. The Labour Party in the UK was out of power for decades, from the mid-1970s until the early 90s. The voters had rejected their brand of socialism. They didn't trust them to manage the economy. And they had to introspect while out of power, while Margaret Thatcher and the Conservatives were in the ascendancy. They had to rethink their proposition. They had to let go of some ideas. They had to become more comfortable with aspiration, prove that they could actually harness the power of the market, harness the power of entrepreneurship, and steward the country's resources effectively, and offer a new vision of labor under Tony Blair with New Labor. Same thing with the Republicans in the United States. In the Clinton years, when they were on the outside, they had to come back as compassionate conservatism under George W. Bush. Whatever you think about these individual parties, the point is that they renewed themselves outside of power. They shed the dead weight in terms of failed leaders and failed ideas, and had to retool, renew themselves and come up with a new offering to society to say, we believe we've got a set of ideas and a set of leaders that can respond to the challenges of the day. That is something that parties do outside of power. It's not something that failed parties do inside power, and the results speak for themselves. Despite all the resources, all the legitimacy in the world, massive support and belief from South Africans, visions like the National Development Plan, vision after vision, document after document, they have not been able to provide the leadership South Africa deserves. And South Africans are no longer buying this idea that the ANC will just renew itself if we keep voting them back into office, that now they finally get it. I think that absolutely rings hollow, unfortunately.
And just finally, Mandla, so President Ramaphosa wrote a letter to the ANC about corruption last year. Now we see this letter from former President Mbeki. Do these letters really help? Are they likely to help change the status quo?
I mean, I think not. I think what we've seen, and this has been the critique that, many inside and outside the ANC have made, which is that, we're almost 4 years into this new dawn. And I mean, how much time do we need to see successful prosecutions? We've got new appointments at the NPA. We've got a whole new leadership team. And yet we have been unable to see high profile prosecutions, except for just now in the case of the current SG, Ace Magashule. But I mean, it's only 3 years now that people are starting to go to court, and that's just one case. And then, of course, these prosecutions take years upon years. I mean, President Zuma has been on trial for these corruption charges for, since the mid-2000s. There are people that are 15 or 16 years old, and as long as they've been alive, President Zuma has been undergoing court processes in relation to these charges. The bar that we need to hold in successful democracies, you see high-profile people with political power, prosecuted and jailed where there has been grand corruption. It may not be every single person caught, but certainly you see many of the big fish caught, tried, go to jail. We've seen that in the US, we've seen that in Brazil, with the Lava Jato investigations. That's what we need to see in South Africa, and unfortunately, we've not seen it. And it simply rings hollow when you're not seeing the results in terms of successful prosecutions, particularly of the big fish, the big political players with political clout.
Well, we'll leave it there for today. Thanks so much for your time this morning. Mason Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, Mandla Isaacs, discussing the letter written by former ANC President Thabo Mbeki to the party. The letter addresses concerns about the ANC's 2021 local government election and, of course, the poor performance by the party.